This is lecture 19. With the last lecture, we finally made it into the Victorian era. Technically, that began in 1837, when Victoria ascended the English throne as a mere teenager. She would rule for some 63 years, longer than any other British monarch. So when Darwin was opening his first notebook on the transmutation of species, July of 1837, Victoria had been in her royal position for only a few weeks. She wouldn't be crowned queen for another year, but she took over for her uncle, William IV, when he died in June of 1837. As we heard in the last lecture, Darwin returned from his voyage around the world aboard the HMS Beagle in 1836. He was one of two world travelers from the early 19th century we learned about. The other was Alexander von Humboldt. Von Humboldt completed his scientific research trip to South America by 1804 and went on to become a celebrated figure of natural science throughout Europe. In fact, both Darwin and von Humboldt brought a great deal of attention to natural science as a result of their exploratory journeys. Darwin's narrative, called the Journal of Researches, appeared in 1839. It was a book that was widely acclaimed, and frankly, it made Darwin famous. Von Humboldt himself called it one of the most remarkable travelogues ever published. He knew Darwin had read his travel accounts from South America, and von Humboldt said if he had indeed inspired Darwin, as Darwin indicated, then Darwin's book might be the greatest success that his work could bring, von Humboldt's. Of course, von Humboldt remained famous throughout his life. We noted last time that his multi-volume book, Cosmos, was itself extremely popular. But these travel narratives weren't the only reason natural science was receiving a lot of attention in the 1830s. As we'll see in Lecture 28, by this time there were two important new institutions of natural science in Germany and Britain that had become very visible parts of the social landscape. The German one had been around for over a decade, and it, plus the new British Association, were providing an additional vehicle for the promotion of natural science. In short, as the 1840s began, natural science was in vogue. It was clamoring for and getting the attention of the public. And then, in the middle of the 1840s, several sensational events occurred in England and France that really accelerated the public's interest in natural science even more. Two of these events had to do with astronomy. We'll deal with them in Lecture 33. But the one that I want to focus on today centered on the appearance of a book. It was what one historian has recently called a Victorian sensation. Everybody was talking about it. And that included people from virtually all levels of society. As long as you could read, you probably wanted to get a hold of this book. Well, what was it about? What scientific subject could possibly have raised such a commotion in 1844? The title of the book was Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, and everything about the book created interest in it. First, the subject matter was fascinating. It was, the author said in a concluding note, the first attempt to connect the natural sciences into a history of creation. Now we know from back in Lecture 3 that the theorists of the Earth from the previous century had speculated along similar lines, but there'd been a lot of scientific discoveries since then, and they were now enlisted in this book as evidence that the Earth had developed slowly over a long time and that it had been so doing, and that it merely was following the dictates of natural laws as it did. This book added all that evidence up. It imparted the sense that its author was saying out loud what many were afraid to face. It was as if the author was saying that it was time to come clean about the implications of natural science. The message was, the old traditionally religious way of thinking about the past and the Earth's past, that won't do anymore. Natural science says otherwise. Now, I need to pause a second to tell you something else, something about the immediate context into which this book landed. A year earlier, up in North Britain, there had been a major development within the Church of Scotland. I'm referring to what became known as the Great Disruption, a split from the Church of Scotland by those unhappy with the compromises made with the modern age. There were those who were not convinced that it was necessary to tolerate, like the Church of Scotland seemed to be doing, some of the recent manifestations of the modern age. To them, it seemed that more and more people were willing to question the traditional way of interpreting the Bible concerning essential truths of the faith. So they broke away from the established church and formed the Free Church of Scotland. When the notorious book appeared, The Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, it added fuel to a fire that was already burning in North Britain. Okay, the subject matter was explosive. What else made the book so captivating? Well, it was published anonymously. Nobody knew who wrote it. Yet from the obvious competence of the treatment, the author was clearly well educated. But who was it? Maybe a woman wrote it. That seemed to be happening more and more, women writing under pseudonyms or even anonymously. Imagine the dilemma that faced a reader. The experts invoked by the author were recognizable figures of natural science, not easily dismissed. From the impressive learning displayed in the volume, the author might even be someone quite respectable. Better not jump to conclusions too quickly. Maybe everyone believes this stuff. All Britain was abuzz. Who had written this bombshell? And another thing, the book was read by an incredible diversity of people in a variety of different settings. As you might guess, it sold an incredible number of copies. It was the publisher's best-selling title for over a decade. There were 11 editions between 1844 and 1860. And starting in 1847, first in Britain and later in the Netherlands and America, it appeared in a cheap People's Edition. That guaranteed wide distribution. There were 2 separate German translations, 2 Dutch translations, and it was reviewed everywhere. Of course, the more free-thinking members of society praised it highly. On the other hand, it was condemned by those who regarded it as a hijacking of natural science in the defense of unbelief. But good publicity or bad publicity, it was all publicity. Historian of science James Secord, who has exhaustively studied the Vestiges and its impact, notes that it was unprecedented for a book of science to attract so much attention. Well, we still don't know exactly what was in the book, so let's turn to that issue. What was it that caused so great a reaction? That's relatively easy to identify. There was one fundamental thing about the book that you either liked or disliked, and that was the author's defense of deism, especially since he or she supposedly based the deistic message on the truths of natural science. Now, we've encountered deism in quite a few of the lectures so far. Deism is that belief in a very particular kind of God, one that treated a world that runs by itself, or created a world that runs by itself, without the need of direct divine superintendence. The way deism came out in the Vestiges was in the author's celebration of the rule of law in nature. If nature was governed by inviolable natural laws, then everything that happened did so in accordance with them. Here's the way the anonymous writer put it. We see certain natural events proceeding in an invariable order under certain conditions, and thence infer the existence of some fundamental arrangement which, for the bringing about of these events, has a force and certainty of action. There was no doubt about it. What happened in nature happened because it had to. Natural law dictated it. Now remember, this didn't rule God out. Deists were not atheists, at least in their own minds. It was just that God had set everything up at the beginning and then accomplished his purpose for creation through the operation of natural law. You'll be interested to learn one of the reasons why the author was convinced of the rule of natural law. I say that because I suspect you'll be a little surprised. A major motivation, which was not made explicit in the book itself, was the author's enthusiasm for phrenology. This became clear to historians after the author's identity became known and they looked into the rest of his activities. Phrenology was the science of reading the localized mental functions of the mind from external anatomical features of the skull. You know, various parts of the skull are correlated with different mental functions, so depending on how your skull is shaped, one could tell whether you have, say, a particularly well-developed imagination or perhaps whether it was underdeveloped. Phrenology had grown increasingly popular in England after the publication of a book by George Combe entitled The Constitution of Man in 1828. What's clear from that book was Combe's strong conviction about natural law. The philosophy of phrenology given in Combe's book emphasized that law ruled everywhere. It was so pervasive, for example, that it even determined the various mental endowments humans possessed. I know, you're thinking Combe was the author of The Vestiges. Sorry, wrong person. But the anonymous writer of The Vestiges was clear about the pervasiveness of the rule of law. Listen to the following rather eloquent passage. The tear that falls from childhood's cheek is globular, through the efficacy of that same law of mutual attraction of particles which made the sun and planets round. The author urged that the solar system, the earth, and life had all come about as the result of what he called creation by law. Now there's an interesting idea. Creation by law is the assertion that the cosmos developed according to the operation of nature's laws and not by divine intervention. It assigned to natural law one of the classic prerogatives God had always possessed, creation. And this author was saying that natural law could create. But once again, the author did not claim that God could be completely replaced. On the contrary, he or she declared that creation by law implied a more exalted and certain view of God than that in the biblical account of creation given in the Mosaic record. Yes, it was a different idea of God from the older traditional one, but a better one, a more noble one in the mind of the author. As you read about God in the book, you came across the following passage. When all is seen to be the result of law, the idea of an almighty author becomes irresistible. Now, you can imagine the reaction to this when British readers came to it. Some, of course, agreed. In fact, a growing number of people, including a great many for whom phrenology carried the same message. But for people of traditional faith, including many of the leading natural philosophers of the day, this ran against their understanding of God's more immediate and intimate relationship to nature. And they'd heard it all before. Many associated this kind of thinking with the French. Of course, 18th century French thinkers like Desmoulins, Buffon, Laplace were famous for it. And to the extent they'd heard about Lamarck, and many had by this time, they knew it had its more recent exponents. But to them, all these writers, including now one of their own, the author of The Vestiges, he was undermining God's superintendence of nature and history. And that simply went too far. We need to know, of course, what specific claims the anonymous author made about the formation of the cosmos and life within it. Well, the book began by reviewing the emergence of the solar system and of our Earth. The author didn't claim originality here. He or she depicted a process of natural development from primitive nebulous matter. That was an idea made famous by our old friend Pierre Laplace. We'll explore this nebular hypothesis of Laplace more in Lecture 33. Suffice it here to say that at the end of the 18th century, Laplace had developed an idea of how the solar system might have originated from the coagulation of primitive filmy matter that had begun to congeal through gravitational attraction and then began to rotate. And Laplace's eminence as an expert in celestial mechanics was known in England in the 1840s. This was due to a translation and commentary of Laplace's work by a very unusual woman, Mary Somerville. We'll meet her as well in that same lecture, the one we learn about Laplace's nebular hypothesis. But the bottom line of all this was that the author was presenting the notion as if it were a fact based on the latest natural science, that the cosmos was ancient, and in addition that the Earth itself was hundreds of centuries old. And he also drew on all those debates we've discussed about Neptunism and volcanism, including the growing consensus that both the agencies of water and heat had been involved in molding the Earth into what it is today. Okay, but did he say anything about the development of life? He did indeed. In fact, it was when he came to the subject of life that his most controversial claims emerged for a British audience. Life originated first and then slowly developed, he said, naturalistically. That is, it developed without God's direct involvement. And it had done so from primitive to more complex forms over immense time. Well, it was one thing simply to declare this. The author, however, laid it out in detail. Each stage of life's development was correlated with an individual geological formation. This was the latest stuff, and it brought everything together conveniently into one place for the reader. No doubt many had heard of bits and pieces of the various claims being made by Buckland and Lyell and Werner, Cuvier, and others. But here, you didn't have to wonder. Here was someone who was telling you how it all added up. You could read this single work and feel that you were on top of the wealth of information few had time to master. What about evolution? Did the author take that on? Well, kind of. Evolution had occurred. There was no doubt about that, but how? This was where things got a bit fuzzy. When explaining how the evolution of life had occurred, the author was vague. Oh yes, there was a declaration that the simplest and most primitive type gave birth to the type next above it. And this again somehow produced the next higher type and so on to the very highest, always in small steps. But how and why did that happen? Here, there was no further illumination. And yes, the author did mention Lamarck. Lamarck possessed a seed of truth, he said, or she said, but the author was not about to sign on to such a discredited system. In particular, the author declared that the Lamarckian mechanism of use and disuse was flawed. And another thing, this deistic vision of the cosmos, life, and the past, while admittedly deterministic, was not allowed to become fatalistic, not at least in the sense that it might lead to unnecessary suffering and the like. The author insisted that the vision being presented was in the end benevolent. But how did he or she know this? What guaranteed that it all worked out for good? Well, first of all, whatever happened was what God intended. So right there, we can be pretty sure that it will be good and not evil. But there was more than that. There was also a good Victorian value being served by the deistic vision of the vestiges. It was one that the author hoped would resonate with the average British reader. In order to reconcile the rule of law on the one hand and a benevolent God on the other, it was necessary, he said, or she said, and these are the author's own words, to suppose that the present system is but a part of the whole, a stage in a great progress. Ah, that great Victorian belief in progress. In the 1840s, there was certainly a lot going on in Britain that confirmed the importance of these social values, in particular progress. Overseas, the spread of the British Empire was vast indeed. Britain was at the height of her power. Industrially, Britain was ahead of all other European countries, and that put Britain on top of the whole world. Life was a beehive of activity. Life at high pressure, as one contemporary put it. Yes, there were those who bemoaned the getting and spending that was too much with us, in the poet's phrase of the time. And yes, the changes had come about so fast that social institutions hadn't been able to change quickly enough. The middle class was gaining at the expense of those above and those beneath. But the enormous demonstrations in the late 1830s and 1840s, in which petitions with millions of names had been presented to Parliament, indicated that progress came with a social price. And Parliament's refusal to act meant that the pressure for change continued to build. So yes, there was widespread belief in progress, but this endorsement of progress as something built into the fabric of nature and history could also be confusing. Did it mean that if you were for progress, that you were against traditional religion? Did it mean that if you were for progress, that the social pressures building up all around were inevitable, that perhaps revolution couldn't be avoided? Many found themselves unsure of their reaction to this new message. So then, what kind of reception greeted this Victorian sensation? Well, that depended on who you were. What you thought of the book correlated nicely with your position in Victorian society. Let me give you a few examples of what I mean. Take aristocrats. Did you discuss the book if you were an aristocrat? Oh, yes. But discussing this sensational book was similar to discussing subjects like phrenology and mesmerism. You treated it like entertainment. That allowed you a degree of distance from getting involved. You could even test the uncertain borders of appropriateness and always have an escape hatch. It was just entertainment, after all. Among the aristocrats, the ultra-Tories were an extreme case. They looked down their noses at natural science when it suggested something they didn't like, at least as to its having any claim on anything of importance. So when this book came out, they regarded its goal as mere fiddle-faddle, as one of them put it. But for the Whigs, the middle class, it was a different matter. As I already indicated, it could put them into a dilemma. They certainly liked the idea that nature was lawful and progressive. That resonated with the political philosophy of the Whigs. The problem was that here such progressive views were being used to support a very disagreeable evolutionary cosmology that went way too far for many of them. Members of the established Anglican Church had a similar problem. They had always relied on traditional arguments from natural theology. That was the branch of theology in which one reasoned from nature to God. And the God you got in traditional natural theology was always the kind that good Anglicans everywhere recognized. It was a God who was in charge of everything, who oversaw things directly, who had a vital interest in what was happening and responded to the prayers of the faithful. So they liked to think that natural science should be part of a Christian gentleman's education. Anglicans were a definite part of the established social order in Britain. If they were going to retain their long-held cultural power as members of the establishment, they were going to have to confront the vestiges as a misunderstanding of the true relationship between religion and science. For those evangelicals in Scotland who had broken away from the established church, there were some, but I hasten to add not all, who opposed the very idea that learning, including natural science, had important value. Too much education only tempted young people to abandon the traditional faith. So they were suspicious of it. And where the vestiges was concerned, that served as proof of their suspicion. Look at what the latest learning did for you. These evangelicals were not fooled by the author's claim to believe in God. For them, the vestiges had led directly to atheism. The kind of God the author believed in, one who didn't interact with the world as a loving father concerned for his children, that was no God at all. How could you pray to that kind of God? Everything was determined. The author had said as much. Prayer couldn't change things in that philosophy. That was the same as no God. It was atheism. And in fact, some found that reading the vestiges did contribute to their loss of faith. And that happened, incidentally, to folks from all quarters of society, including literate workers. Of course, there were those who were delighted with the book. Those associated with the radical movement for free thought latched on to the vestiges with pleasure. They were used to being lumped together with anarchists and other radicals and just dismissed. So for them, this was a moderate appeal to progress. Their own declarations were far more radical. These groups saw an association with natural science as an opportunity to bring them respectability. They could say, see, the kind of truth we've been advocating is written into the fabric of nature. We're not the crazy people you've made us out to be. Read the vestiges. We're not that far off. Well, I think you can see that the appearance of the vestiges was a problem of one kind or another for almost everyone in Victorian society. Exactly what kind of problem depended on what social position you held. No wonder the book caused such a sensation. All right, I know you want to know about the author of the work. What kind of person had written this outlandish book? Was it a scientist? Do we have scientists yet? We'll tackle that question just a little bit later in this series. When we do, we'll see that the status of the practitioner of science was beginning to come into its own during these years in Britain. There were educated gentlemen of science who occupied university chairs of natural philosophy. As part of the establishment, they were expected to be disinterested and pious, not the kind of persons who would be given to extreme positions. And by and large, that was who such professors turned out to be. a pretty conservative lot. So they tended not to like the Vestiges. There was not much chance that one of them would have written it. Of course, not all gentlemen of science were in the universities. There were wealthy individuals who loved natural science and who were well-read. Generally, this type of person would also be expected not to hold extreme positions like that endorsed in the Vestiges, but it was not inconceivable that one of these private persons could have written it. The learning reflected in the book suggested one of them might have written it and then tried to protect himself by not giving his name. There were many rumors of authorship. They included, for example, a privately wealthy young and cosmopolitan gentleman of science who had not that long ago returned from a jaunt around the world, Charles Darwin. But no, he wasn't the author. Once you went outside the university, there were as yet precious few ways that one could use science to earn a living. So that introduced the possibility that the author was one of the disaffected men of science, one of those natural philosophers who hadn't been able to break into the rather closed and exclusive university circles. Or maybe it was a woman. One suggestion was Harriet Martineau. She was the kind of radical thinker who just might do something like this. It was known how she praised mesmerism for curing her while she was in France, and she seemed to care so little for social convention. Another woman candidate was Lord Byron's daughter, Ada Lovelace. Everyone knew how passionately interested in cosmology she was, and she did associate all the time with various notable men of science. After a few years, conventional opinion about who the writer was settled onto a Scottish publisher named Robert Chambers. He didn't confess to being the author, and the controversy raged on into the 1850s. Chambers was a liberal Whig reformer. As such, he was dead set against aristocratic privilege, so he was not one who felt an obligation to accept tradition for tradition's sake. But he also detested what he thought of as the hypocrisy of evangelicals. In fact, he never publicly admitted being the author of the Vestiges. But there were a few chosen individuals who did know his secret, and eventually it came out. Robert Chambers had captured the attention of Britain in a way few others did during this time. He was the author of the Victorian sensation. Now, historians have learned a lot from this episode. Once the impact of the Vestiges was made clear and appreciated, we historians have had to revise our usual view of evolutionary history. That, of course, is always centered around Darwin in the 19th century. But from all we have just discussed, it's easy to see that Darwin didn't create the crisis over evolution and evolutionary cosmology. It was everywhere in Britain well before Darwin's book came along 15 years after the Vestiges. And add to that another compelling circumstance. As we'll learn in Lecture 21, Darwin's idea of natural selection was rejected by almost all readers for the first 75 years after Darwin made it public. So Darwin's significance was not because he revealed a compelling new truth to his age. When it comes to understanding the 19th century on its own terms, then, we can't really assign Darwin the exclusive place that he's so often been given. For example, we know that it was after he came back from the Beagle voyage that Darwin came to the ideas of evolution and natural selection. He was in the process of developing these concepts when Chambers' book came out. But the violent reaction against the Vestiges convinced Darwin more than ever that the time was not ripe for him to make his ideas generally known. Of course, he did make them known in 1859, but there was a certain sense of déjà vu on the part of many. In France, people felt they'd been through all this with Lamarck. And in Britain, the Vestiges was still a fresh memory. It would take some time before the difference about Darwin's theory would be appreciated. So what is clear is that Darwin's significance is not that he revealed a new truth that was generally acknowledged right away. So how then shall we understand the significance of the origin of species? Well, that will be one of our tasks when we take up Darwin's story in the next lecture.